The crystal chandelier crashed to the marble floor with a sound like breaking stars, its 1,000 pieces scattering across the Whitmore estate's grand foyer as Seraphina Gray stood frozen on the servants' staircase, clutching a dusty jewelry box that contained the truth she had been seeking her entire life. Below her, Margaret Whitmore lay crumpled beside the shattered chandelier, blood pooling beneath her silver hair, while her son Theodore knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he pressed them against the wound on her head. "Mother, stay with me," he whispered desperately, but Margaret's eyes were fixed on Seraphina, and her dying words cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. "The birthmark, on her shoulder, the crescent moon, she's not the maid, she's my sister's child. She's the rightful heir to everything." And with those words, Margaret Whitmore, the woman who had enslaved Seraphina for 15 years, who had made her scrub floors and tend fires and raise children that weren't her own, revealed the secret that would destroy one family and restore another, that the servant girl they had called worthless was actually their blood, stolen as a baby and sold into servitude to secure an inheritance that was never rightfully theirs. 23 years earlier, Seraphina had been born Isadora Evangeline Whitmore Sterling, the daughter of Rosalind Whitmore Sterling and her beloved husband Edmund, in the very bedroom where she now slept on a narrow servant's cot. Her mother Rosalind had been the true heiress to the Whitmore fortune, the eldest daughter whose inheritance should have passed to her child. But Margaret Whitmore, Rosalind's younger sister, had harbored a lifetime of jealousy and resentment that would eventually poison every relationship it touched. When Rosalind died in childbirth and Edmund perished in a riding accident just months later, baby Isadora became the sole heir to one of the most powerful estates in England, a fortune that Margaret believed should have been hers by right of survival rather than birth order. In her grief and desperation, Margaret had made a deal that would haunt 3 generations. She paid a corrupt midwife named Mrs. Blackthorne to declare the baby dead, to forge death certificates and grave markers, while secretly selling the child to a family of servants who needed money more than they needed questions answered. For the first 8 years of her life, Seraphina had lived as the adopted daughter of Thomas and Mary Grace, kind but poor people who had been told she was an orphan child from a distant parish, never knowing they were raising stolen nobility while accepting monthly payments from Margaret Whitmore for their silence and care. The Grace family had loved her genuinely, had given her the name Seraphina because she looked like an angel with her golden hair and unusual violet eyes, but they had also been careful to never let her wander too far from their cottage, never to ask too many questions about her origins, never to examine too closely the expensive locket she wore around her neck. A locket that contained a miniature portrait of Rosalind Whitmore Sterling and bore the family crest that would have revealed everything if anyone had bothered to look closely. Thomas Grace had been the groundskeeper for a smaller estate owned by distant Whitmore relatives, and both he and Mary had understood that their comfortable life depended on maintaining certain secrets, on accepting certain gifts without demanding explanations, on raising their adopted daughter to be grateful for her circumstances rather than curious about her past. But when Seraphina turned 8, tragedy struck the Grace family as well, removing the last barrier between her and the cruel destiny that Margaret had planned. A fever swept through their village, claiming both Thomas and Mary within days of each other, leaving Seraphina orphaned for the second time in her young life. Margaret Whitmore arrived at the cottage before the bodies were even cold, her face a mask of false sympathy as she informed the dying Mary Grace that she would, graciously, take responsibility for the child they had raised. "Don't worry about little Seraphina," Margaret had said, her voice dripping with manufactured kindness while her eyes remained cold as winter stone. "I'll make sure she has a home at Whitmore Manor. She'll be well cared for, I promise you that." Of course, Margaret's definition of care was very different from what Mary Grace imagined in her fevered final moments. Instead of raising Seraphina as a ward or distant relative, Margaret brought her to Whitmore Manor as a servant, telling the household staff that she was taking in a poor orphan out of Christian charity, that the girl would earn her keep through honest work and humble service. At 8 years old, Seraphina became the youngest member of the Whitmore Manor servant staff, assigned to the most menial tasks and treated with a cruelty that seemed excessive even by the standards of class-conscious Victorian society. Margaret's own children, Theodore and Evangeline, were only a few years older than Seraphina, but they were taught to treat her as less than human, to order her about and criticize her work and never question why their mother seemed to take such particular pleasure in humiliating the small servant girl who looked remarkably like the family portraits hanging in the main hall. "You exist in this house by my mercy alone," Margaret would tell Seraphina during their private moments, usually when she was assigning some particularly degrading task. "Never forget that you are nothing but a charity case, a burden that I have chosen to bear out of the goodness of my heart. You will work hard, you will be grateful, and you will never, ever imagine that you deserve anything more than what I choose to give you." These words became a kind of catechism that shaped Seraphina's understanding of her place in the world, convincing her that she was indeed fortunate to have shelter and food, even if that shelter was a drafty attic room and that food was often nothing more than scraps from the family table. As the years passed, Seraphina grew into a young woman of startling beauty and surprising intelligence, despite Margaret's best efforts to keep her ignorant and subservient. She learned to read by studying discarded newspapers and letters, taught herself arithmetic by managing household accounts that the other servants couldn't handle, and developed a refined manner of speaking by listening carefully to the conversations of the family and their guests. Her natural grace and dignity shone through despite her humble circumstances, creating a paradox that made some visitors to the manor wonder aloud why such an obviously well-bred girl was working as a servant. Margaret always had ready explanations. Seraphina was the daughter of fallen gentry, or she had been raised above her station by foolish adoptive parents, or she was simply mimicking her betters without truly understanding proper behavior. But privately, Margaret watched Seraphina's development with growing anxiety, recognizing in the girl's features and mannerisms the unmistakable echoes of her dead sister Rosalind, seeing in Seraphina's natural elegance the aristocratic bearing that no amount of servant training could entirely suppress. The relationship between Seraphina and the Whitmore children became the most complex dynamic in the household, a twisted maze of affection, resentment, guilt, and confused loyalty that would define all their futures. Theodore Whitmore, 2 years older than Seraphina, had initially treated her with the casual cruelty that children often display toward those they perceive as beneath them, but as they grew older together, he began to see past his mother's propaganda to recognize Seraphina's inherent worth and dignity. He would secretly bring her books from his father's library, teach her to read Latin during stolen moments in the garden, and defend her against the worst of the other servants' contempt with a protectiveness that confused and alarmed his mother. "She's not like the others," he would argue when Margaret criticized his kindness towards Seraphina. "She's smart and kind and she works harder than anyone else in this house. Why shouldn't I treat her well?" But Margaret would always have the same response. "Because she is a servant, Theodore, and you are a gentleman." The distinction matters, and if you forget it, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Evangeline Whitmore, on the other hand, seemed to have inherited her mother's capacity for cruelty along with her sharp intelligence and stunning beauty. She treated Seraphina with a mixture of contempt and fascination, sometimes defending her against outside criticism but more often using her as a convenient target for her own frustrations and insecurities. "You think you're special, don't you?" Evangeline would hiss during their private encounters, usually when she was angry about some social slight or romantic disappointment. "You think because you're pretty and speak well that you're somehow different from the other servants. But you're not. You're nothing, and you'll always be nothing, and the sooner you accept that, the happier you'll be." Yet even Evangeline couldn't entirely suppress her awareness that there was something different about Seraphina, something that went beyond mere prettiness or intelligence to touch something deeper and more troubling. Sometimes, when the light hit Seraphina's face at just the right angle, Evangeline would see something that made her pause, made her wonder, made her ask questions that her mother would quickly silence with sharp words and sharper punishments. The household dynamic became even more complicated when Margaret's husband, Charles Whitmore, began to notice Seraphina's transformation from child to woman with an attention that made everyone uncomfortable for different reasons. Charles was a weak man, easily manipulated by his stronger wife, but also possessed of appetites and desires that Margaret could neither fully control nor entirely satisfy. As Seraphina grew into her beauty, Charles began to find excuses to seek her out, to corner her in empty hallways or isolated rooms, to make comments about her appearance, and suggestions about ways she might improve her situation. That made her skin crawl with fear and revulsion. "You're a very special girl, Seraphina," he would whisper, standing too close and touching her arm or shoulder with hands that lingered longer than propriety allowed. "If you were a bit more grateful for the kindness this family has shown you, you might find your circumstances considerably improved. Think about it." These encounters filled Seraphina with a terror that went beyond mere disgust, because she understood instinctively that she had no protection against Charles's advances, no one who would believe her word against his, no recourse if he decided to take what he wanted regardless of her consent. It was Theodore who became her unexpected protector, recognizing the danger his father represented and positioning himself as a barrier between Charles and Seraphina whenever possible. Theodore had grown into a young man of considerable moral courage despite his privileged upbringing, and he was disgusted by his father's behavior towards someone who should have been under their family's protection rather than prey to their predation. "Stay away from her," he warned his father during one particularly tense confrontation that Seraphina overheard from behind a closed door. "She's under our roof, which makes her our responsibility. If you can't treat her with respect, then at least leave her in peace." Charles had laughed, a sound like breaking glass in a graveyard. "You're very noble, my boy, but you're also very naive. The girl is a servant, nothing more. She exists for our convenience, and if I choose to avail myself of that convenience, it's hardly your place to object." But Theodore's response had been swift and uncompromising. "If you touch her, I'll kill you. I mean that literally. I will kill you, and I'll make it look like an accident, and Mother will inherit everything while the world mourns your tragic and untimely death. Test me if you think I'm bluffing." The threat worked, but it also created new tensions within the family, as Margaret realized that her son's protection of Seraphina went beyond mere chivalry to something that looked dangerously close to genuine affection. She began to watch them more carefully, to restrict their interactions, to assign Seraphina tasks that would keep her away from Theodore as much as possible. But love, or whatever complicated emotion had developed between the young master and the servant girl, is not easily controlled by logistics and manipulation. Theodore and Seraphina found ways to meet in secret, to share conversations and books and stolen moments that sustained them both through the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the manor. These meetings were innocent by any objective measure. They talked about literature and philosophy, about their dreams for the future, about the injustices they saw in the world around them, but they were also profoundly intimate in ways that transcended physical contact, creating a bond that would prove unbreakable even under the most devastating pressures. During one of these secret meetings, when Seraphina was 16 and Theodore 18, they were discovered by Evangeline, who had been suspiciously tracking her brother's movements for weeks. She burst into the library where they were reading together, her face contorted with fury and something that looked almost like jealousy. "So this is where you disappeared to," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "Having romantic trysts with the help. How very democratic of you, Theodore. I'm sure Mother will be fascinated to hear about your literary discussions with our little servant girl." Theodore stood immediately, his own anger flaring in response to his sister's attack. "There's nothing improper happening here, Evangeline, and you know it. Seraphina is more intelligent and better read than half the society girls you associate with. If you can't appreciate her qualities, that says more about your limitations than hers." But Evangeline was beyond reason, driven by emotions she couldn't entirely understand herself. "She's a servant!" she screamed. "She's beneath us. She doesn't belong in our library, reading our books, pretending to be our equal. She belongs in the kitchen or the scullery or whatever holes servants crawl into when they're not working. The confrontation that followed would haunt all of them for years, as truths were spoken that couldn't be taken back and alliances were formed that would shape their adult relationships. Serafina, who had remained silent during the initial exchange, finally found her voice and her courage. "I may be a servant in this house," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But I am not beneath anyone. I work honestly for my keep, I harm no one, and I deserve basic respect even if I can't command it. If my presence in this library offends you, Miss Evangeline, then I'll leave gladly. But I won't apologize for existing, and I won't pretend to be less than I am just to make you more comfortable with your own cruelty." The words hung in the air like a challenge, transforming the dynamic between them from simple class conflict to something more personal and more dangerous. Evangeline stared at Serafina with something approaching hatred, but also with a grudging recognition of the courage it had taken to speak so boldly to someone who held complete power over her circumstances. Theodore, meanwhile, had made a decision that would change everything for all of them. "Serafina is right," he said, moving to stand beside her in a gesture of solidarity that was both touching and reckless. "She deserves respect, and she deserves better than the treatment she receives in this house. If you can't see that, Evangeline, then you're as blind as you are cruel." He turned to face Serafina directly, taking her hands in his despite the scandal such contact would cause if observed by others. "I don't care about class distinctions or social expectations or what anyone else thinks is proper. You are the finest person I've ever known, and I love you. Not as a master loves a servant, not as charity or condescension, but as an equal loves an equal. If you'll have me, if you can imagine a future where such things are possible, then I'll find a way to make it work. I'll defy my family, I'll give up my inheritance, I'll do whatever it takes to build a life where we can be together openly and honestly." The declaration sent shockwaves through the household that reverberated for months afterward. Evangeline ran immediately to their mother with news of Theodore's disgusting infatuation with the servant girl, and Margaret's response was swift and ruthless. Serafina found herself banished to the most remote parts of the house, forbidden from any contact with Theodore, assigned to the most degrading tasks that would occupy every moment of her day and night. Theodore was sent away to university earlier than planned, ostensibly for his education but actually to remove him from Serafina's corrupting influence, until he could come to his senses about appropriate relationships. But Margaret's most devastating punishment was psychological. She began a systematic campaign to convince Serafina that Theodore's declaration had been nothing more than youthful folly, that his feelings were temporary and shallow, that his family's opposition would inevitably wear down his resolve until he abandoned her for a more suitable bride. "He'll forget you within a month," Margaret told Serafina during one of their private conversations, her voice filled with false pity designed to maximize cruelty. "Young men like Theodore fall in love with the idea of rebellion, with the romance of defying their families. But when it comes time to actually sacrifice their comfort and position for love, they always choose the path of least resistance. He'll meet some pretty debutante at university, someone who can offer him social advancement instead of social suicide, and you'll become nothing more than an embarrassing memory of his foolish youth. The sooner you accept that reality, the less it will hurt when it happens." These words were like poison drops administered daily, designed to erode Serafina's confidence in Theodore's love and her own worth, to convince her that hoping for anything better than servitude was not just foolish but actively harmful to everyone involved. For 2 years, Serafina endured this psychological torture while Theodore's letters became increasingly infrequent and then stopped altogether. Margaret made sure that Serafina knew about each letter that didn't arrive, each social event where Theodore was seen with eligible young women, each rumor about his romantic attachments that filtered back from London society. "He's engaged, you know," Margaret announced one day with particular satisfaction, watching Serafina's face carefully for signs of devastation. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the daughter of a duke. Very appropriate, very beautiful, very wealthy. The wedding is planned for next spring. I thought you should know so you could begin to put this foolishness behind you once and for all." The news hit Seraphina like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the temporary nature of Theodore's affection and the impossibility of crossing class boundaries for love. But Margaret had underestimated both Theodore's determination and Seraphina's resilience. The engagement announcement was a lie, designed to break Seraphina's spirit completely and convince her to accept the marriage proposal that Charles Whitmore had arranged for her with one of the estate's tenant farmers, a crude man twice her age who was willing to overlook her lack of dowry in exchange for her beauty and domestic skills. When Theodore returned unexpectedly from university, having received no responses to his letters and grown suspicious about his family's explanations for the silence, he discovered the extent of his mother's manipulations and the depth of Seraphina's suffering. The confrontation between mother and son was volcanic in its intensity, as years of suppressed tensions and competing loyalties erupted into open warfare. "You've been intercepting my letters," Theodore accused, his voice shaking with rage. "You've been lying to both of us, manipulating us, trying to destroy something beautiful because it doesn't fit your narrow vision of what's appropriate. How dare you? How dare you play with our hearts like that?" Margaret's response was coldly calculating. "I dare because I'm your mother, because I love you more than you love yourself, and because I refuse to watch you throw your life away on a servant girl who will drag you down to her level and destroy everything this family has worked for generations to build." The argument that followed revealed the true depths of Margaret's desperation and the lengths to which she was prepared to go to maintain her control over the family fortune and social position. "You think you love her," she said to Theodore, her voice filled with venom and something that sounded almost like fear. "But love is a luxury that people like us can't afford. We have responsibilities, obligations, duties that transcend personal feelings. This estate, this family, this fortune, they're not just ours to enjoy, they're ours to preserve and pass on to future generations. If you marry that girl, you'll lose everything. You'll be cut off, disinherited, cast out of society. You'll live in poverty and regret it for the rest of your life. And she'll regret it too, when the novelty wears off and she realizes what she's cost you. Is that really what you want? Is that really love?" But Theodore had matured during his time away, had gained perspective on his family's values and his own priorities, and Margaret's arguments no longer carried the weight they once had. "If loving Seraphina means losing all of this," Theodore said, gesturing around the opulent room where they stood, "then I'll lose it gladly. Money and position mean nothing if they come at the cost of integrity and genuine connection. Seraphina has more nobility in her smallest finger than this entire family has in all our combined bloodlines. If you can't see that, if you can't accept her as she deserves to be accepted, then perhaps it's your vision that's distorted, not mine." But even as he spoke these brave words, Theodore was beginning to understand the true scope of the opposition he faced, the institutional power that would be arrayed against any attempt to marry across class lines, the social and financial weapons that his family could deploy to destroy both his and Seraphina's futures if he persisted in his inappropriate attachment. The realization was sobering, but it was also clarifying, helping him understand that love alone would not be enough to overcome the barriers between them, that they would need strategy, resources, and allies if they hoped to build a life together. Meanwhile, Seraphina had been developing her own understanding of the impossible situation they faced, and her own plans for navigating the treacherous waters of family politics and social expectations. The years of cruel treatment and psychological manipulation had not broken her spirit, but they had taught her valuable lessons about power and survival, about the importance of patience and careful planning when facing enemies who held all the apparent advantages. She had continued to educate herself in secret, had developed skills and knowledge that went far beyond what was expected of a servant, and had begun to piece together certain inconsistencies in her own history that suggested there might be more to her origins than Margaret had ever admitted. The locket she had worn since childhood, the one that had supposedly belonged to her adoptive mother, contained details that didn't match the stories she had been told about her past. The miniature portrait inside looked remarkably like the family paintings in the manor's main hall, and the crest engraved on the back was clearly a Whitmore family symbol, though she had been told her adoptive parents were simple country folk with no connection to nobility or wealth. These observations had led Serafina to begin a careful investigation into her own past, using her access to household records and family documents to search for clues about her true identity. What she discovered was fragmentary but suggestive: birth records that didn't quite align with death records, financial transactions that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate, and most significantly, a pattern of payments from Margaret Whitmore to Thomas and Mary Grace that began exactly around the time that Serafina would have been born and continued until their deaths. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, painting a picture of a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple class prejudice or maternal protectiveness. If her suspicions were correct, then Margaret's cruelty toward her wasn't just about preserving social boundaries. It was about protecting a secret that could destroy the Whitmore family's claim to their wealth and position. Armed with this knowledge, Serafina made a decision that required tremendous courage and strategic thinking. Instead of confronting Margaret directly with her suspicions, she decided to gather more evidence while appearing to submit to the family's demands for her future. She agreed to consider the marriage proposal from the tenant farmer, appeared to accept Theodore's supposed abandonment with resigned sadness, and behaved in every way like a defeated woman who had finally learned her proper place in the world. This performance convinced Margaret that her campaign of psychological warfare had been successful, that Serafina had been broken and would no longer pose a threat to the family's stability or Theodore's future. But in reality, Serafina was using her apparent submission as camouflage for an increasingly sophisticated investigation into the Whitmore family's secrets, gathering evidence that would eventually give her the power to claim not just respect and love, but justice and restitution for years of cruelty and manipulation. The breakthrough came when Serafina discovered a hidden compartment in Margaret's private study, concealed behind a false panel that she found while cleaning the room during one of Margaret's trips to London. Inside were documents that told the entire story of her kidnapping and enslavement, correspondence with Mrs. Blackthorne about the arrangement to dispose of baby Isadora, financial records showing payments to the Grace family for their silence, and most damaging of all, a confession written in Margaret's own hand that detailed her motivations and methods for stealing her sister's child and fortune. "I couldn't let Rosalind's brat inherit what should have been mine," Margaret had written in what appeared to be a moment of guilt-ridden honesty. "The fortune, the estate, the position, they should go to the surviving family member, not to some infant who would fritter it all away on nurses and tutors. I convinced myself that I was protecting the family legacy, that Rosalind would have wanted me to have it all rather than let it be wasted on a child who couldn't appreciate its value. But the truth is simpler and more shameful. I was jealous, and I was greedy, and I was willing to destroy an innocent life to get what I wanted." The confession continued with details that made Serafina's blood run cold, revealing the extent of Margaret's calculations and the depth of her cruelty. "The girl is growing up to look exactly like Rosalind," Margaret had written years later. "Sometimes I catch her at certain angles and I think I'm seeing my dead sister's ghost. It's disturbing, but it's also useful. It reminds me why I had to do what I did, why I can never let her discover the truth. If she knew who she really was, she would destroy everything I built. She would claim her inheritance, expose my theft, ruin my children's futures. I have to keep her broken, keep her convinced that she's nothing, keep her grateful for whatever scraps I choose to throw her way. It's the only way to protect my family from the consequences of my choices." The document was like a roadmap to Margaret's psychology, revealing not just her crimes but her ongoing fears and vulnerabilities, the pressure points that could be used to force her into confession and restitution. But Serafina also discovered something that complicated her desire for simple revenge, evidence that Theodore and Evangeline were not Margaret's biological children either, but rather the offspring of Charles Whitmore and his previous wife, who had died when they were infants. Margaret had married Charles as a widow and adopted his children, raising them as her own while using their legitimacy to strengthen her claim to the Whitmore fortune. This revelation meant that Theodore's love for her was not inappropriate or impossible. They were not blood relatives, despite both bearing the Whitmore name, and their marriage would not violate any natural or social laws beyond those of class distinction. More importantly, it meant that Margaret's entire claim to the family fortune was built on deception and manipulation, that she had no more right to inherit than anyone else who married into the family without producing legitimate heirs. Armed with this explosive knowledge, Seraphina faced a choice that would determine not just her own future but the futures of everyone she had come to care about despite their complicated history. She could expose Margaret immediately, claiming her rightful inheritance, and destroying the woman who had stolen her life and identity. She could use the information as leverage to force Margaret to accept her relationship with Theodore and provide them with the resources to build a life together. Or she could find a way to use the truth for justice rather than simple revenge, creating a resolution that would restore what had been stolen without destroying the innocent victims of Margaret's crimes. The choice was complicated by her genuine affection for Theodore and her complex relationship with Evangeline, who despite her cruelty was also a victim of Margaret's lies and manipulations, raised to believe in a family structure that was built on stolen foundations. The decision was made for her when Charles Whitmore, driven by years of frustrated desire and emboldened by what he believed was Seraphina's powerless position, attempted to force himself on her in the isolated servants' quarters late one night. The attack was violent and terrifying, but Seraphina had been prepared for such a possibility, and had armed herself with both a knife and the knowledge that would destroy her attacker if he persisted. "Touch me again and I'll scream loud enough to wake the entire household," she warned him, pressing the blade against his throat with steady hands. "And when they come running, I'll tell them everything I know about this family's dirty secrets. Did you know that your wife stole me as a baby? Did you know that I'm the rightful heir to everything you think you own? Did you know that one word from me could destroy not just you but your entire family?" The threat worked, but it also marked the end of Seraphina's ability to hide her knowledge and plan her revenge in secret. Charles retreated, but she knew he would tell Margaret about the confrontation, and that Margaret would realize her secret had been discovered. The next morning brought the confrontation that would change everything, as Margaret burst into Seraphina's room with murder in her eyes and desperation in her voice. "You little witch," she hissed, advancing on Seraphina with raised hands. "Charles told me what you said to him, the lies you've been spreading, the delusions you've developed about your importance. I should have gotten rid of you years ago, when you started getting ideas above your station." But Seraphina was ready for this moment, had been preparing for it since she discovered the truth about her identity. She produced the documents from their hiding place, holding them out like a shield against Margaret's fury. "These aren't lies or delusions," she said, her voice steady despite the danger she faced. "These are confessions, written in your own hand, detailing exactly how you stole me from my parents, and stole my inheritance from me. I know who I am, Margaret. I'm Isadora Evangeline Whitmore Sterling, daughter of Rosalind and Edmund, rightful heir to this estate and everything in it. And you are nothing but a thief and a kidnapper who has spent 23 years trying to cover up your crimes." The revelation that followed was like watching a dam burst, as 23 years of accumulated lies and suppressed guilt came pouring out in a torrent of accusations, justifications, and desperate attempts at damage control. Margaret alternately denied the accusations and tried to justify them, claiming that she had acted in Seraphina's best interests, that the child would have been better off dead than growing up as an orphaned heiress, that she had provided a loving home and honest work that was more valuable than inherited wealth. "You have no idea what it would have been like," she screamed, her composure completely shattered. "Growing up with that fortune, with all those people trying to marry you for your money, trying to use you and manipulate you and destroy you for what you owned. I saved you from that. I gave you a real life, honest work, genuine relationships not based on greed and calculation. But her words rang hollow even to her own ears, revealing themselves as the self-serving rationalizations they had always been. The confrontation was interrupted by Theodore's arrival, drawn by the sound of raised voices and Margaret's obvious distress. He entered the room to find his adoptive mother and the woman he loved facing each other like combatants, with documents scattered between them that would rewrite everything he thought he knew about his family and his future. "What's happening here?" he demanded, looking between them with growing alarm. "Mother, what are these papers? Serafina, why do you look so?" But before anyone could answer, Evangeline appeared in the doorway behind him, having been drawn by the same sounds of conflict, and the entire family found themselves together in the small servants' room where the truth would finally be spoken in its entirety. The documents were passed from hand to hand, read aloud in Margaret's own words, their implications spreading like ripples through water as each family member grasped the magnitude of what had been hidden from them. Theodore's reaction was immediate and devastating, as he realized that the woman he had called mother for his entire life was responsible for stealing and enslaving the woman he loved, that his comfortable childhood had been built on the foundation of another child's suffering, that his inheritance was actually Serafina's by right of birth and law. "How could you?" he whispered, staring at Margaret with horror and disgust. "How could you do such a thing to an innocent baby? How could you watch her work as a servant in her own home, treat her like dirt, make her grateful for scraps from a table that should have been hers by right?" But Margaret was beyond shame or remorse now, driven by the desperate need to preserve whatever she could from the wreckage of her exposed secrets. "She's nothing!" she shrieked, her voice breaking with hysteria. "She's a servant's brat who got ideas above her station. These documents prove nothing. They're forgeries, lies, attempts to steal from the rightful heirs." But her protests were futile against the weight of evidence, the detailed confessions in her own handwriting, the financial records that corroborated every aspect of Serafina's accusations. Evangeline's response was more complex, colored by years of conflicted feelings towards Serafina and her own growing understanding of how thoroughly she had been manipulated by the woman she thought was her mother. "If this is true," she said slowly, her voice trembling with the effort of processing such massive revelations, "then everything we believed about ourselves, about our family, about our right to live here, it's all been a lie. We're not the rightful heirs. We're not even blood relatives. We're just, what are we?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, because none of them knew how to answer it, how to redefine themselves and their relationships in light of such devastating truths. Serafina, meanwhile, was experiencing her own complex mixture of vindication and grief, satisfaction at finally being believed and horror at the pain her revelations were causing people she had come to love despite their complicated history. But the confrontation took a deadly turn when Margaret, realizing that her exposure was complete and her position untenable, made a desperate attempt to destroy the evidence and silence the witness to her crimes. She lunged for the documents in Serafina's hands, trying to tear them apart or throw them into the fireplace, screaming that she would never let a servant's brat destroy her family and steal her children's inheritance. The struggle that followed was brief but violent, as Serafina fought to protect the proof of her identity while Margaret clawed and scratched and threatened to kill her rather than lose everything she had spent decades building on stolen foundations. It was during this struggle that Margaret lost her balance and fell backward down the main staircase, her head striking the marble floor with a sickening crack that echoed through the entire manor like a gunshot. The scene that followed Margaret's fall was one of chaos and revelation, as the servants came running at the sound of the crash and found their mistress dying at the bottom of the stairs while the family gathered around her in various states of shock and grief. But even in her final moments, Margaret's last act was one of unexpected redemption, as she used her dying breath to confirm everything that Serafina had claimed, perhaps seeking some final absolution for the sins that had defined her adult life. "The birthmark!" she gasped, her eyes fixed on Seraphina with desperate intensity. "Show them, the crescent moon, on your shoulder, just like Rosalind's. She's not the maid, she's my sister's child, she's the rightful heir." And with those words, Margaret Whitmore died, taking with her the last vestiges of the lie that had shaped 3 lives and leaving behind a truth that would reshape them all. The weeks that followed Margaret's death were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, social scandal, and emotional upheaval as the full scope of her crimes became public knowledge and the rightful ownership of the Whitmore estate was established through both documentary evidence and physical proof. The birthmark that Margaret had mentioned in her dying words was indeed present on Seraphina's shoulder, a distinctive crescent-shaped mark that was clearly visible in early portraits of Rosalind Whitmore Sterling and that had been noted in the original birth records for baby Isadora. Combined with the confessional documents and the testimony of surviving servants who remembered the mysterious payments to the Grace family, the evidence was overwhelming and legally conclusive. Seraphina was formally recognized as Isadora Evangeline Whitmore Sterling, sole heir to one of the largest fortunes in England, owner of estates and investments that made her one of the wealthiest women in the country. But the legal victory came with emotional costs that were far more complex than Seraphina had anticipated during her years of planning for this moment. Theodore and Evangeline, who had been raised as her social superiors, were now legally dependent on her charity, living in a house that belonged to her, supported by a fortune that was rightfully hers, facing a future that would be determined entirely by her decisions about justice and mercy. The role reversal was stunning in its completeness, but it was also painful for everyone involved, creating new tensions and uncertainties that were in some ways more difficult to navigate than the old ones based on class distinction and family hierarchy. "I don't know how to be your servant," Theodore said to her during one of their first conversations after her identity was established, his voice heavy with confusion and grief. "I don't know how to live in this house as your dependent, how to accept charity from someone I love. But I also don't know how to leave, how to build a life somewhere else when everything I've ever known was built on lies and stolen foundations." Seraphina's response to this impossible situation would define not only their future relationships, but her own character as a person who had been given ultimate power over those who had once held ultimate power over her. She could have chosen revenge, could have turned them out onto the streets with nothing, could have made them experience the same powerlessness and humiliation that she had endured for 15 years. Many people in her situation would have done exactly that, and few would have blamed her for seeking retribution against those who had benefited from her suffering, even if they had been unwitting participants in Margaret's crimes. But Seraphina had learned different lessons from her years of servitude, had developed a moral compass that pointed toward justice rather than vengeance, toward healing rather than perpetuating cycles of cruelty and exploitation. "You're not my servants," she told Theodore and Evangeline during the family meeting where they discussed their future arrangements, her voice gentle but firm with newfound authority. "You're my family, in the truest sense of that word. Not because we share blood, though Theodore and I don't, and that's something we can explore when the legal matters are settled, but because we've lived together, suffered together, grown up together in ways that created bonds deeper than genetics or social convention. This house is big enough for all of us, this fortune is large enough to support multiple families, and I have no desire to rule over you like some kind of feudal queen. What I want is to build something new together, something based on honesty and mutual respect instead of lies and artificial hierarchies." Her words were carefully chosen to acknowledge the pain of their situation, while offering hope for a different kind of future, one where their relationships could be rebuilt on healthier foundations. The proposal she made was both generous and strategically wise, reflecting her understanding that lasting peace could only be built through genuine partnership rather than imposed through superior power. Theodore and Evangeline would remain at Whitmore Manor as her family and partners in managing the estate, with legal documents ensuring their security and establishing clear roles that respected both their experience and her ultimate authority as the rightful owner. Theodore, with his education and natural leadership abilities, would oversee the business operations and agricultural management, while Evangeline would handle social obligations and charitable activities that had always been part of the family's public responsibilities. Both would receive generous allowances that would allow them to maintain their accustomed lifestyle, while also contributing meaningfully to the estate's operations and the community's welfare. But perhaps most importantly, Serafina established a foundation dedicated to identifying and assisting other children who had been victims of similar crimes, using her resources and experience to create systems that would prevent future kidnappings and ensure that stolen children could be reunited with their rightful families or provided with appropriate care. Margaret's crime against me was not unique, she explained to the local magistrate who was documenting her case for potential legal precedents. There are other children out there, other families destroyed by greed and desperation, other lives built on stolen foundations. If my suffering can prevent even one other child from experiencing what I experienced, then perhaps some good can come from all this pain and deception. The foundation became her life's work, transforming her personal trauma into a force for social reform and child protection that would eventually influence legislation and social policy throughout the region. The romantic relationship between Theodore and Serafina, which had been complicated by perceived class differences and family opposition, now faced new challenges related to the dramatic reversal of their social positions and the trauma they had all experienced during the revelation of Margaret's crimes. Theodore struggled with feelings of guilt and inadequacy, unsure how to love someone who had gone from servant to mistress overnight, uncertain whether his feelings were genuine or influenced by her newfound wealth and status. I fell in love with Serafina the servant, he confessed to her during one of their long walks through the estate gardens where they had first shared their secret meetings. I'm not sure I know how to love Isadora the heiress. Everything is different now, the way people look at us, the way they treat you, the expectations and responsibilities that come with your position. I don't want you to think that my feelings have changed because of your fortune, but I also can't pretend that the fortune doesn't change everything about our future together. Serafina understood his concerns because she was grappling with similar questions about identity and authenticity in the wake of such massive life changes. The woman who had scrubbed floors and tended fires for 15 years was still part of who she was, but she was also discovering aspects of herself that had been suppressed by years of servitude and psychological manipulation. Her natural intelligence, which had been dismissed as servant's cunning, was revealing itself as genuine brilliance that had been starved of proper education and opportunity. Her grace and dignity, which had been interpreted as mimicry of her betters, were showing themselves to be authentic aristocratic bearing that came from her genetic heritage and her own moral development. She was becoming someone new while also reclaiming someone she had always been but never been allowed to express fully. I'm still the same person who fell in love with you in this garden, she told Theodore, taking his hands in hers with the same gentle affection that had sustained them through years of secret meetings and stolen moments. My circumstances have changed, but my heart hasn't. If anything, knowing the truth about my past has made me more certain about what I want for my future. I want to build a life with you, not because you're a convenient choice or because I need protection or social advancement, but because you saw my worth when the rest of the world saw only a servant. You loved me when loving me meant sacrificing everything you thought you wanted from life. That kind of love is rare and precious, and it's not diminished by changes in fortune or social status. Her words reassured him, but they both understood that rebuilding their relationship would require time and patience as they navigated their new roles and responsibilities. The wedding that eventually took place was nothing like the grand society affair that might have been expected for someone of Serafina's newfound status and wealth. Instead, it was an intimate ceremony held in the same garden where they had fallen in love, attended by the servants who had become her friends during her years of bondage, the tenant farmers who had benefited from her fair and generous management of the estate, and the children from local orphanages who had been helped by her foundation. Evangeline served as matron of honor, having gradually overcome her initial resentment to develop a genuine sisterly affection for the woman who had shown such unexpected mercy to those who had unknowingly participated in her oppression. "I hated you for years," Evangeline admitted during her wedding speech, tears streaming down her face as she spoke from the heart. "I hated you because you were everything I wanted to be but couldn't, kind, genuine, strong in ways that had nothing to do with money or position. But mostly I hated you because you made me see how cruel and shallow I had become, how much of my identity was built on the suffering of others. You could have destroyed me when you gained the power to do so. Instead, you chose to save me, to help me become someone worthy of the friendship you've offered. That kind of grace is divine, and I'm honored to call you my sister." The speech that Serafina gave at her own wedding reception became famous throughout the region and was eventually published in newspapers across England, serving as an inspiration for other victims of injustice and a challenge to those who held power over the powerless. "I stand before you today not as someone who has triumphed over evil, but as someone who has learned that the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemies but in transforming them into friends," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of guests from every level of society. "For 15 years I was told that I was nothing, that I deserved nothing, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps were thrown my way. But I learned that our worth is not determined by others' opinions or society's hierarchies. Our worth comes from how we treat those who have power over us and how we use whatever power we gain over others. I could have used my newfound position to seek revenge against those who wronged me. Instead, I choose to use it to build something better, something based on justice and mercy rather than cruelty and exploitation." She continued with words that would be quoted for generations afterward, becoming a foundational text for social reformers and advocates for children's rights. "Every child deserves to know their true identity, to be raised with love and respect, to have opportunities limited only by their own abilities and efforts rather than by the circumstances of their birth or the greed of those who hold power over them. Every servant deserves dignity, every worker deserves fair treatment, every human being deserves to be seen as valuable regardless of their social position or economic status." These are not radical ideas. They are the basic principles of a just society, and if we cannot uphold them in our own homes and communities, then we have no right to call ourselves civilized. The words resonated far beyond the wedding reception, inspiring social legislation and charitable organizations that would continue her work long after her lifetime. The years that followed brought both personal happiness and broader social impact as Serafina and Theodore worked together to transform not only their own estate but the entire region's approach to class relations and child welfare. They established schools that educated children from all social backgrounds together, created apprenticeship programs that allowed talented young people to advance based on merit rather than birth, and implemented labor practices that treated workers as partners in productivity rather than expendable resources. Their marriage became a model for other cross-class relationships, proving that love could indeed transcend social boundaries when supported by genuine respect and shared values rather than exploitation or condescension. Evangeline, meanwhile, found her own path to redemption and purpose through her work with the Foundation, using her social connections and natural intelligence to investigate and expose other cases of child trafficking and inheritance fraud. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to protecting vulnerable children and supporting families torn apart by greed and deception. "I spent so many years being cruel because I thought cruelty was strength," she reflected during one of the Foundation's annual reports. "Now I know that real strength comes from using whatever advantages you have, wealth, education, social position, to protect those who lack such advantages. Every child we save, every family we reunite, every criminal we expose is a step toward the kind of world where what happened to Serafina can never happen again." The impact of their work extended far beyond their immediate community, influencing national debates about child protection, workers' rights, and the responsibilities of inherited wealth. Serafina's story became a symbol of resilience and moral courage, while her practical reforms demonstrated that individual transformation could lead to broader social change when combined with resources and determination. Universities began teaching case studies based on the Whitmore estate's labor practices. Charitable organizations adopted models based on Serafina's foundation, and lawmakers referenced her story when crafting legislation designed to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation and abuse. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on the way families throughout the region began to question their own assumptions about class, worth, and the treatment of those who served them. Servants in other great houses began to demand better treatment, pointing to the Whitmore estate as an example of how workers could be respected and fairly compensated. Parents began to examine their own relationships with adopted or foster children, recognizing the psychological damage that could result from treating any child as fundamentally less valuable than biological offspring. Social reformers used Serafina's story as evidence that poverty and low birth did not indicate inferior character or limited potential, that many people of great natural ability were being wasted through systematic oppression and lack of opportunity. 20 years after the revelation of her true identity, Serafina stood once again in the garden where she had fallen in love with Theodore, but this time she was surrounded by her own children, 3 daughters and 2 sons who had been raised to understand both their privilege and their responsibility to use that privilege in service of justice and compassion. She was also surrounded by the dozens of young people who had been helped by her foundation, many of whom had gone on to successful careers and were now helping other vulnerable children in their turn. The garden had been expanded to include memorial stones for both Margaret and her parents, acknowledgments of the complex web of love and pain that had shaped all their lives, reminders that even those who cause great harm are worthy of forgiveness if not necessarily trust. "What have you learned from all of this?" one of her daughters asked her as they walked together through the rose beds that Theodore had planted to commemorate their first wedding anniversary. It was a question that Serafina had been asking herself for 2 decades, and her answer had evolved as she had gained perspective on the events that had transformed her from servant to heiress to social reformer. "I've learned that our circumstances don't define us, but our responses to those circumstances do," she said thoughtfully. "I could have become bitter and vengeful after learning the truth about my childhood. I could have used my power to punish those who had wronged me, to prove my superiority over those who had once looked down on me. But bitterness and vengeance would have made me no better than Margaret, would have continued the cycle of cruelty that had caused so much pain for so many people." She paused beside the fountain that now marked the center of the memorial garden, watching the water sparkle in the afternoon sunlight, while she gathered her thoughts for words that would capture the essence of everything she had experienced and learned. "Instead, I chose to believe that every person has value, that every relationship offers opportunities for growth and healing, that even the worst circumstances can become foundations for building something beautiful if we approach them with courage and love rather than fear and hatred. Margaret stole my childhood, but she couldn't steal my capacity for joy. She tried to break my spirit, but she only made it stronger. She attempted to teach me that I was worthless, but instead she taught me how precious every human being truly is, how much damage we can cause when we forget that fundamental truth, and how much good we can accomplish when we remember it." The final words she spoke that day in the garden would eventually be carved on her memorial stone when she died decades later, having lived to see several generations of children grow up in a world that was measurably better because of the choices she had made in response to the injustices she had suffered. "Love is not just a feeling between individuals," she said to her daughter, her voice carrying the weight of lived wisdom earned through years of struggle and triumph. "Love is a principle that should govern how we structure our families, our communities, our entire society. When we love truly and completely, we cannot tolerate systems that dehumanize or exploit others. We cannot accept circumstances that deny children their basic rights to safety, identity, and opportunity. We cannot remain passive when we have the power to transform suffering into healing, injustice into fairness, despair into hope. This is the work of love in the world, Not just feeling affection for those close to us, but actively creating conditions where all people can flourish regardless of the circumstances of their birth or the mistakes of their past. As the sun set over the estate that had been her prison and became her platform for changing the world, Seraphina reflected on the miraculous transformation that had begun with Margaret's dying confession and ended with a legacy of reform and compassion that would outlive them all. She had started life as Isadora Evangeline Whitmore Sterling, lost that identity to become Seraphina Grace the servant, and ultimately reclaimed not just her name and fortune but her power to shape the world according to principles of justice and love. The journey had been painful, the revelations devastating, the responsibilities overwhelming at times, but the outcome had justified every moment of struggle and uncertainty. She had not just survived her ordeal, she had transformed it into a force for good that would protect countless other children from experiencing similar suffering. The story of the maid who became a daughter, who discovered she had always been a daughter but had forgotten how to claim her birthright, became more than just a tale of individual triumph over adversity. It became a testament to the power of truth to heal old wounds, the possibility of forgiveness to break cycles of revenge, and the potential for love to create justice where law and tradition had failed. Most importantly, it demonstrated that our past does not have to determine our future, that even those who begin life in the most disadvantaged circumstances can rise to positions of influence, and use that influence to ensure that others never have to endure what they endured. This is the true meaning of transformation, not just changing our own circumstances, but changing the world so that transformation becomes possible for everyone who needs it, so that every child can grow up knowing their true